Good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for coming to the second of our community conversations here at Transgender Law Center. Last week, we heard from powerful leaders on what Black power and resistance look like right now. And today, we're going to hear from experts in the field about the executive actions pouring out of the White House and what they mean for our communities. I'll let each of them introduce themselves, and then we'll jump right in. If you're watching on Facebook or YouTube, leave comments or questions in the chat, and we'll see if we can get to some of them towards the end of our conversation today. My name is Aaron Greensmith. I'm the Deputy Director of Policy here at the Transgender Law Center. Let's jump right in and hear from our guests today. Merrique Jenson from Transformations, Aaron Ngan from the LGBTQ Center in San Diego, and Elizabeth Gill from ACLU. Marique, you want to go first, please, then Aaron, and then Elizabeth?
Sure. Thank you so much, TLC and Heron, for having me. Heron and I just got to know each other a bit more and be with each other actually in Northwest Arkansas this past weekend. So my name is Merrique Jenson, she, her pronouns. I'm the president and founding executive director of Transformations, which is a trans women of color led organization. And we serve 3 states, Missouri, Kansas, and Northwest Arkansas, so the Ozark Mountain region. And as you can imagine, it is a very busy time for us with all of the anti-trans legislation happening in these very, very red states. And so one of the things that we just did was create a trans town hall this past weekend in Northwest Arkansas. It made the local news stations, believe it or not, the media coverage was actually really positive and affirming. Maybe not the comments, but the coverage was. And we are actually being requested to do it for now Central Arkansas. So we're in conversation to do that in April. But right now it's the thick of the anti-trans legislative season, and we do a lot of different programs, including running a camp for trans leaders of color called Liberation Camp in the Ozarks every fall, a national virtual summit for trans women of color in leadership, mentorship, and advocacy called The Dolls Are Thriving, as well as doing mutual aid and community responsive work.
Hi, folks. My name is Aaron Ngan. My pronouns are he, him, and they, them, and I am the Civic and Community Engagement Specialist at the San Diego LGBT Community Center. I'll talk a little bit about what the center does, but I'll really get into it when we get to my little piece of today's conversation. But the short of it is that the San Diego LGBT Community Center has been around for more than 50 years. We are the largest health and human services organization for LGBTQ plus folks in all of San Diego County. And so we are both a services provider as well as an advocacy organization, which really puts us in a unique spot, especially with our close proximity to the US-Mexico border. So thank you so much for having us today, and I'm excited to get into today's conversation.
Hi, folks. Elizabeth Gill. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a senior counsel with ACLU's LGBTQ and HIV project. And folks may know the ACLU is a large civil rights, civil liberties organization. We've been around for over 100 years. And a thing that we are doing a lot of in this time is suing over these unconstitutional orders that are coming out of the White House.
Thank you so much, all. This is going to be such a rich conversation, so let's dive right into the first question, which is actually for me. What are executive actions? What the heck is a regulation? What is a comment period? Is Trump passing laws without Congress? I'm going to take moderator's privilege and share a little bit about the regulatory process first with folks. As everyone knows, there are 3 branches of government: the legislative branch, or Congress, who pass laws; the executive branch, or the president, who signs laws and directs agencies to make rules and regulations that enact the laws; and then the judiciary branch, or the federal courts, who interpret the law when there's confusion or contradiction. Executive actions are actions by the president that direct their agencies, like the Department of Education or the Department of Health and Human Services to make rules that administer the laws passed by Congress. Lately, the president has been issuing a lot of executive actions impacting immigrants, Black people and other people of color, and transgender and non-binary people, to name only a few of the impacted populations. These actions are directing Trump's agencies to make rules threatening providers of health care for trans kids, threatening sanctuary states, threatening institutions who teach inclusive history, and threatening people who want to support and provide programs and services to migrants. Lately, the agencies have started to issue their proposed rules through a process called notice and comment, through which agencies share draft rules with the public and ask for comments on how the public feels. So depending on the proposed rules, the public might have 30 or 60 or 90 days to share our comments with the agencies in the hope that our comments will form the final rules. In February, the Department of State issued its draft rules for the passport gender marker change, the rules that will prevent trans folks from updating our gender markers on federal documents and prevent people from accessing an X marker. Now, if you would like to comment on these proposed rules, there are two fairly easy ways. The first of which is much easier. The ACLU itself has a comment portal you can find on its website to issue comments directly to the Department of State. And you can always submit comments directly through a government website called regulations.gov. Now, the executive action directing the Department of State to issue these rules is already being litigated, and that brings me to our first guest. Elizabeth, the ACLU is involved in some litigation or lawsuits around a few of the presidential actions, including the passport rules. Can you tell us a little bit about those, please?
Yes, I'm happy to. I'll just say one thing, which is if you are going to comment for a federal rulemaking, it's helpful with a hostile administration like this one if you go through an organization like the ACLU so that we can keep track of how many people are commenting. It's just a useful figure for us to have and not necessarily something that the administration will talk about otherwise. There are already lawsuits in place. So the president, as Aaron said, the executive orders really can only be directives to the agencies. However, they are tone setting for what's going to happen. And they use very broad and hostile language, especially around immigrants and trans folks. But certainly there's, things that impact Black folks as well. And just, all of the work that this country has done on, having more inclusive spaces in education generally. So it's not just, but I'll focus for this conversation on the anti-trans executive orders that are coming out. And so, as Aaron mentioned, the State Department, the Trump administration issued an executive order. And the way the executive orders are named are inherently propaganda, essentially. And so one of his first day orders was purporting to define sex in a way for every federal law, in a way that erases the existence of trans and intersex folks. And so that executive order is entitled, gender ideology, a term that is not a legal term and is something that, right-wing folks often throw around. And that came out right away. And then the president has issued a set of additional executive orders that reference that one. So embedding in a number of other actions, the idea that, there are only two sexes, that you are not only the sex that you're assigned at birth, although presumably this is how that's practically going to function, but that you are the sex of your embryo. It's not a particularly coherent executive order. It's not tethered to science. It is clearly meant to scare people and just invite open discrimination against trans folks. And so the litigation has unfolded not necessarily against that executive order itself, but in the ways that it's being implemented harmfully. So a key area with that, the State Department, even before engaging in notice and comment rulemaking, went ahead and stopped the practice of updating people's passports with the appropriate gender marker. So the ACLU filed a lawsuit on that. And currently that lawsuit is on behalf of a set of individuals. It will likely expand to more individuals in a form that's called a class action. What that means, and so we went to court, and the court enjoined the State Department from enforcing its new policy of rejecting gender marker changes. And what that means is right now that the injunction is limited, but it is a statement by a court that the implementation of this executive order in this way is unlawful. I think there's a lot of talk about whether this Trump administration, because these executive orders are so unlawful to begin with, whether they will listen to the courts. But for now, we are hoping that they do. It will be a different level of problem if they don't. And that's what litigation can accomplish. And so in addition to the passports case, there is a case, we in Lambda Legal have a case, and a lot of these cases are brought by a set of LGBTQ legal advocacy orgs for the anti-trans executive orders. There are a number of other cases about the anti-immigration executive orders, and additional cases around the spectrum about the firing of federal employees and other actions of this administration that have largely been performed to date via executive order. The other cases that are out there in the world, and the cases have been succeeding thus far with respect to the anti-trans executive orders in stopping them from taking their threatened action. So one of the most problematic ones that came out is an executive order stating that any entity that provides gender affirming care to young people under the age of 19 will lose their federal funding. The president doesn't have the authority to do that. The funding is apportioned through Congress, and so the president doesn't have the authority to unilaterally say, I'm going to withhold funding. There are steps that he can take via the Health and Human Services Agency, but the executive order in and of itself doesn't have that power. However, that is a significant threat. Hospitals in the United States and clinics significantly rely on federal funding because of Medicare and Medi-Cal. And so a number of hospitals around the country went ahead and shut down care. And so it's important to get into court to reassure folks that this is not something that they have to comply with instantaneously. So we have a lawsuit with Lambda Legal. We have an injunction on the federal funding piece that is nationwide. The state of Washington and a number of other states also sued and got a similar injunction. So from a ground perspective, hospitals shouldn't be shutting down care. They can rely for the time being on the fact that that policy, even though the president, no funding had been removed from hospitals yet, but the courts have said the president doesn't have the authority to do this. This is unconstitutional. Additional areas where there will be litigation, there is litigation or will be litigation with respect to the anti-trans actions of this administration are in the prisons context. There are several cases where folks were told that their housing would be changed. We have, heard stories working with TLC about healthcare being cut off for people. obviously that's an emergency context, and there are several cases in that arena, and there will be more. There are there is a case about the exclusion of trans folks from sports, a separate EO out of this administration. And as folks may have seen, this governor of Maine got into a confrontation with President Trump over that issue last week, and it's possible that that the state of Maine will sue. Then there's also a case about federal grants and those being limited if they pertain to, again, gender ideology in any way, which is an inherently vague mandate. I mean, what does it mean to promote gender ideology? So does it mean that you exist as a queer person? So there's Lambda Legal has a lawsuit about that, and they are also seeking preliminary relief, which we hope they get. So that's the sort of landscape. I think, there are executive orders that have gone out about schools and about what can be taught in schools, what books can be in schools, what is the treatment of trans kids in schools. And there isn't litigation currently directly challenging those executive orders, but as folks implement them in harmful ways, which unfortunately they will presumably do, there will be litigation around that.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I heard a lot in what you were saying, that the president is attempting to do things, is trying to do things. And luckily we have organizations like ACLU and TLC who are standing up and using the law to fight back. I was wondering if you could share a tiny little bit more about what it means when what it means very broadly when a president attempts to do something, and whether these actions are legal actions or not. We hear a lot of questions about whether or not the president is allowed to do these things. It seems like he's passing laws when he's issuing these actions. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. So the short answer is that the president can direct agencies to take action, but it has to be lawful action. And so these executive orders go beyond the scope of what our laws permit. And so there will have to be, there's an inherent unlawfulness to the scope of much of what the president is asking for, even like in the anti-trans space in particular, that requiring discrimination against transgender people, we do not think is lawful, right? Like, we litigate cases against all kinds of entities for that discrimination, saying that it's unconstitutional to discriminate against trans people. So the Constitution is the base rule of law in the country, and the president can't violate the Constitution. And it will be up to the courts to decide what the Constitution means. There are also constitutional provisions that provide for the separation of powers of the different branches of government, and Congress apportions the funds. And so many of these funding streams that the president is invoking in his threats, like, for example, much of school funding comes from Title I, which is a civil rights law that passed to support schools, but it has specific purposes. It's allocated, that money is allocated in specific ways. And so the president doesn't have the authority to threaten to take, he doesn't own all the federal money, right? Congress actually does that. And there are parameters that they have historically set in a whole body of law on how the money needs to be spent. And the president just doesn't have discretion to cut it off. So part of these lawsuits is also arguing that there's an inherent separation of powers problem in many of the president's actions here.
Thank you so much. I know we're all hungry to hear, and I'm already seeing comments on YouTube about how the executive actions are impacting folks on the ground. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And Merrique, would you be willing to talk to us about what's going on the ground in Kansas, Missouri, Arkansas. Like you said, I was just out there for a town hall, and I heard folks with one voice say that they were hungry for community, hungry to connect with one another, and hungry to know, like I said, how these executive actions are impacting folks on the ground.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, thank you so much again, Heron, for coming out. It was a great town hall. And as Heron's sharing, we had a trans town hall that happened in Northwest Arkansas, which is part of the region that Transformations, the organization that I run, serves. We also serve the full state of Missouri and Kansas. And our organization was founded and based in Kansas City. But since really the pandemic, we have been covering really these three states and primarily building our power building core and our mobilization bases out of Kansas City, St. Louis, and Eureka Springs, Arkansas. So, right now, I think that trans folks are really nervous and scared. I mean, I think that that is the general consensus, especially in red states. And I say that because I have a little bit of context and concept of what it does look like differently. When I was offered this job, I had actually left Kansas City and was doing van life for a little bit and, hustling and putting myself, supporting myself however I could. And I ended up in Seattle and actually was getting settled there. And when I was getting settled in Seattle, I got the call to be the executive director for Transformations, even though I founded the organization back in 2016, because they had raised enough money finally to be able to afford to pay for kind of a humble ED salary. And so for the entire time of being in the role of this, I've been building out the work, being both living in a place that is heavily protected and safe for trans folks, and then serving a region that I grew up in and that I have all of my relationships in that is completely under attack constantly. If folks don't know, Missouri specifically has one of the worst anti-trans series of legislation outside of Texas in this country. And that is just one of the three states that we serve. So, I mean, one of the things that we know is that there is a narrative, I would say, that exists right now that trans people should sort of be prepared or move or mobilize or do what I call the great trans migration to the Pacific Northwest to get their resources and to stay safe. And while that is available and is an option for some, it is not a reality for most trans folks in our region. And I think that there are some narratives out there that I think have been used to fuel and harm trans folks that are used by this administration that certainly are the mythologies within the executive orders. And what I mean by that is that, trans kids are having surgeries, that trans people are all on gender affirming care and just had this like great experience. Then all of a sudden, now it's being taken away from us when the reality in the region that in Missouri, Kansas, and Arkansas is that actually most trans folks don't even have medical providers that are culturally competent still to provide care for us. So before these executive orders even existed, we saw that if a trans person was going to maybe their local free clinic, 75% of the times or more, those experiences were actually really harmful. Those experiences were actually transphobic, especially for trans kids without affirming parents, without what I call sort of the helicopter parents, right? Who are like making sure their child is safe in every way possible. We know for trans girls, we know for trans kids in survival mode, we know for trans women of color that in particular, the experiences of getting care for undocumented folks, for folks that are immigrants and trans, right? These experiences getting care already was really horrific. And so now the executive orders have only further harmed a community that was so vulnerable and not even receiving the basic needs that they deserve to pull those away. And I want to be clear that these executive orders aren't actually about they're actually not about trans people in a lot of ways. I mean, trans folks are, of course, being used as the tool, right? And we've seen that over and over. But these executive orders are actually about hurting all of you, right? Every American family, right? We've already seen that Trump has clearly shown his interest is in buddying, and being, I gotta be appropriate because we're, this is I can't say what I think, but his interest is in being, the best bro friend possible to the other billionaires. And it's about keeping billionaires pocketed, about keeping himself pocketed. It's actually not about the average American family that has no trans people in it, right? These folks are still being harmed as well. We see that in Arkansas, Missouri, Kansas, community states that heavily rely on Medicaid, that heavily rely on a lot of, accessible services and care, that what's happening with these executive orders are impacting everyone, are impacting communities and American families that are the most impacted and marginalized. And so I want to say that, for us at Transformations and for the work we're seeing with trans communities, we've always been at the forefront of gender affirming care. We're not going to need, let's keep it 100. We won't need a hospital or a clinic or some white cis doctor in the mix or not in order for us to be ourselves. Because long before that came in, long before WPATH came in, right, the world provider of transgender health, and all of these models that still are, heavily used within the mainstream hospitals that are heavily outdated and don't just work off the idea that trans people can know who we are, right? Before any of this existed, trans folks were around. And so I think that this also is just an example of how manipulation, gaslighting, bullying are all in play with these orders that are meant to be obtruse, are meant to be hard to understand, are meant for the everyday citizen to say, well, I don't know, it looks really wild. I guess we can't do this. And so it's important for organizations like the ACLU, like Trans Law Center, like Lambda Legal, to be there to challenge these, right? Because that's how we are able to also say that while there are these executive orders, most is, Aaron, as you said, most, if not, and most of them have been challenged, and most of them are not actually just going through without being touched. So I think right now for trans folks in general, I think we need to mobilize. Fear is, being fear and being paralytic is not going to serve us. I think what we can do is to be, strategists, to have a really clear analysis on who is impacted by this and why, is to fund trans organizing. I say that because in the past 2 years, right, as a small grassroots organization that up until the next month from now, thanks actually to a grant we're receiving from TLC that's allowing us for the first time ever in the history of our organization since 2016 to hire the second ever full-time staff member, right? So that's huge. But if it wasn't for that, and if it wasn't for work, and often that's how it works too, is that trans people fund trans people. And what we need to see is more cis folks, is more allies stepping up, is more folks actually caring about these issues and connecting the dots, that this is about your families and about you as well. And it's meant for us to feel siloed. It's meant for us to feel scared. I say that as someone who is Mexican, who is second generation, who is a child of immigrants, whose family migrated here, my mother's side from Mexico. My dad is also white. He's from the Ozarks. So these conversations happening about Trump's America, and also, frankly, using working class poor white folks to really pull from their own cycles of systemic harm and violence, where folks like Trump don't care about you. They don't give a but about you, right? What we know is that it's meant to be used. These systems, these folks who are on the margins are meant to be used to both look like they're attacking each other, look like they're the threat, when in fact the threat is right there in the Oval Office.
Thank you so much, Merrique. TLC has been recommending a couple of things right now to trans people specifically. And the first of that is to reach out to our trusted community organizations like Transformations, like the San Diego LGBTQ Community Center. And I'm so grateful that we have both of you on the call today, and also grateful to ACLU as well. Marique, I heard you say that everyone is being impacted by these executive actions, that everyone has a gender identity, everyone has a sexual orientation. And I know that you said that trans people are kind of like the object lesson right now. Can you talk a little bit more about how trans folks can, or rather, how non-trans folks can support trans people right now, and maybe can support organizations like Transformations?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm going to take that in two parts. One I'm going to say is that so part of the work that we do at Transformations is we are literally on the ground in the region. So depending on the times of year, we're pulling in our amazing teams of leaders. We have a national community advisory board that consists of leaders from both our region, Missouri, Kansas, and Arkansas, as well as some national experts and leaders, all trans leaders of color. So depending on what's happening, we actually are pulling in these folks and doing all types of creative, responsive programming. So 2 years ago, we did a liberation tour where we traveled all across our region and hosted a series of town halls. So the town hall that we just did wasn't the first time of us doing this. I think some of the things that make us unique in our work is being really skilled facilitators, moderators, mediators, and having, years in the work, right? We're not necessarily green in this. And so when we were going around and doing that, we also were making sure to pay all of trans leadership. And I think in our region, there's still this model that exists that trans folks should be asked to do something, to join a panel to help provide, free cultural competency or coaching or training and not pay for that. And I think that the reality is we need to understand that trans folks' wisdom is well honed, that the resiliency we have often comes from going through lots of trauma, and that the least our allies can do is fund and fuel that. Transformation started as an organization that provided trans youth support groups. We did that for 4 years. We ran a few different types of trans youth groups, a general group for kids 12 to 18 years old who are trans, non-binary, or questioning their gender identity. And through that, an informal parent guardian group formed. And then we also had a trans girls group. And we saw that some of the parents helped support and fund the group, but even those parents who love their kids maybe didn't have the resources or means, or maybe their money was going into supporting their trans children in all types of ways. There wasn't necessarily community buy-in. There definitely wasn't a larger LGBT buy-in. And I want to name that because one of the tactics that the right is using right now is actually going to gay and lesbian leaders, right? We've seen this with some of the national organizations, right? I won't say them here because I don't want to get y'all in trouble, but if this was my own stuff, I would easily say it, right? One of our leaders was a statewide director from the orgs and was just fired. And that same organization fired most of their BIPOC organizers across the South, most of their trans organizers, because they're buckling down for this administration. And part of what we see from LGBTQ orgs, right, that are often led by cis gay men or cis lesbian women, or maybe, the exceptional non-binary person nowadays, is that we don't necessarily see a commitment to trans leadership, much less trans leadership of color. So that's one. The other is that our allies are needing to have conversations with each other about where they fall with their relationships with trans folks. And I say that because when we were testifying about legislation, right, when we were down in Little Rock and talking about SB 270 2 years ago, which was criminal sexual indecency of a minor. So if trans women were in women's restrooms, that they could have prosecuted us as child predators and been on the sex offender registry, and potentially looked at our genitals to see if we were real women, because we were predators in women's restrooms. That did not pass the way it was written. But in that process, when I went down to testify, I was pretty shocked to see that hardly any trans women had even talked about this legislation. And so sometimes when these legislations are happening, there is a default to pull in the parents or the nice priest or the nice rabbi or the nice grandma, and actually not have trans folks talking about how this will impact us ourselves. And also, many of the people, specifically the men who are pushing out these bills and legislation, are absolutely obsessed with trans women in their personal lives. They're the ones who are hitting us up, whether it's through sex work, whether it's on the ads, whether it's on Grindr, right? And they want relationships with us. They have relationships with us. So there's hypocrisy there, because the only way that this is happening, right? Why is everybody so heavily pushing these anti-trans bills? If you talk with the dolls and the girls, they'll tell you and say, honey, somebody's wife caught something and is upset. Like somebody said, go get those, right? I can't say it here, right? But go get those slur words, right? Go get them, because they're upset that their husband or their son or their nephew actually likes trans women. And that is the reality. So I think that there's a deeper conversation there about the cults of toxic masculinity, about how white supremacy, about how men really F each other up, that needs to exist, because that is also what's fueling all of this on the national level.
Thank you so much, Merrique. I think we need to have a conversation about trans misogyny, about anti-Blackness, about how United States history is built on misogyny, trans misogyny, and anti-Blackness, and how those all intersect to impact trans women of color very deeply. And I would love to transition, to talking with Aaron right now, because I know that the San Diego LGBT Community Center is doing some incredible work supporting trans migrants, trans women of color, and folks who are trying to access programs and services in their local communities. Aaron, could you tell us a little bit about what the community center is doing right now?
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much, Aaron. So yeah, let me go a little bit into some context about what the San Diego LGBT Community Center is, kind of where we got our start, and that'll kind of build into the work that we're doing today. But kind of how I mentioned earlier, the San Diego LGBT Community Center has been around for over 50 years. We are, again, the largest health and human services provider for LGBTQIA plus folks in all of San Diego County. And that really means that a lot of folks look to us both as a service providing organization, but also as an advocacy organization. And that's really what makes our organization so unique, is that we're able to take the work that we do with our clients and translate that to meaningful advocacy at different levels of government with community partners. And we are able to really respond to the needs of our community as it arises. And so one really unique thing about the center is that we are just so close to the US-Mexico border. We are the largest LGBTQ plus community center in close proximity to this border. And so in the 50 years that we've existed in San Diego, there has really been an intentional binational approach to our work. So I can kind of fast forward a little bit to 2018, outside of the 1970s, to when we really saw a lot of migrant caravans coming to the US-Mexico border. At the time, the center really dug their heels into the ground and said we need to work with local organizations, not just on the San Diego side of things, but in Tijuana. And so we worked with those organizations to support local local binational folks seeking asylum. And we really met that moment by making intentional steps to work with both asylum seekers and folks who live in Tijuana, so that we're not really looking at this as just folks who are kind of passing through or folks who are moving through the border, but folks who are moving through the border every day. As part of this really interesting binational economy, where we see so many, for example, of our students who come to school in San Diego County, and they cross the border every day. We really needed at the time to work with folks whose experience really is in both spaces. And so kind of from that, we really understand that a large number of LGBTQIA plus folks who migrate to San Diego are part of the trans community and identify as trans. And we've really made strong connections with folks who are organizing at the intersection of trans advocacy and support services, as well as immigration. So for example, one of these organizations is Proyecto Trans Latinas. And they are an organization that, they started out kind of as a mutual aid organization where they were like, hey, you know, we can find you someplace to stay while you're getting your asylum cases heard. We can make sure that you have access to food and all of that kind of stuff first and foremost, and then also do the advocacy work, making sure that folks are visible and that they are getting their needs met, you know, on both the food and housing and all of that kind of basic needs, as well as just getting their stories out in the world in front of elected officials and folks like that, right? And so at the time when the center had a fully staffed Latinx services, we would go out and do work at the Otay Mesa Detention Center that is just in our backyard. We would provide folks with access to legal aid, healthcare. We would do things like connect folks to HIV medication, right? Something that a lot of times folks in detention are denied, right? We see that so often. And so in this critical moment now, the center is prioritizing that we have staff at the ready to provide services for our community that they're asking for. You know, we're not just, you know, doing an assessment of, oh, this is what we think we need, this is what we think they need. No, we are responding to the needs that they are asking for day in and day out. And so that is stuff like know your rights education, being able to access legal aid resources. And really, we are just building out our relationships throughout our binational region, such as really working with our local Mexican consulate, right? And so being able to just understand how binational our folks are really has been key to ensuring that their needs are met. And so as far as the provision of our services, all of our services are available regardless of your immigration status. And as an organization, we have made sure that we have policies in place to respond to any ICE presence at our sites. So we've done some trainings with our folks just to make sure that, you know, our staff feel safe, our staff feel protected, and our clients do as well. And so transitioning to honestly a WIN event that we're putting on tomorrow. We are putting together a Know Your Rights workshop for LGBTQIA plus migrants and immigrants, regardless of status. You know, we are making this just a very open space, as well as for allies to attend as well. So we are just really being intentional about responding to the impacts of immigration policy and enforcement on LGBTQ plus folks. We are taking a regional approach to this work. So the San Diego LGBT Community Center really is, a lot of our social services are concentrated within the city of San Diego, but the county of San Diego is huge. And so we are really making sure that this is the first of a series of events. We're going to go up into North County and work with folks there. We're going to go into our East County where we've had, which is, to a lot of folks' surprise, has a high concentration of, you know, transphobic legislators locally and just organizationally. And we are going to go into our South Bay. So we're really trying to expand and make sure that our entire county is being served by these services, and that we're ensuring that we are responsive to the direct needs of the community and understand that this educational component that we're developing, it's very volatile. The information that we're providing to folks is going to change in real time. What we say today may be very different from what we say tomorrow, depending on a court ruling, depending on any executive actions, depending on the enforcement that we are just seeing in the stories that we're hearing from our clients. And so we're very aware of all of this, and we're making sure that our community is able to trust us as a trusted messenger and is able to see us as a resource that, okay, if I'm scared, if I'm someone who is afraid to leave my house, where I'm rationing my HIV medications and taking them only 2 to 3 times a week because I'm afraid that I'm going to get cut off from my access to medications. Those are the things that we're hearing from our clients, and we need to empower them and make sure that they know that, you know, 1, they need to be taking their medications, and 2, that they have rights, and that, you know, if a law enforcement comes up to them, that they really, that, you know, hand them this red card that tells them that you have your rights. These are your constitutional rights. I'm not going to talk to you. I'm going to, you know, I need a lawyer. done. And we really need to also bring in those allies as well. And really, we see that education is empowerment. Whether you're an immigrant, whether you're LGBTQIA plus identifying, whether you're both, or you're just an ally. And so we really need to make sure that our community as a whole is able to come together and support the most vulnerable of us in a time of fear, of misinformation, and just when a lot of work needs to be done.
Thank you so much, Aaron. I heard you talk so much about informing the community through Know Your Rights, through your event tomorrow, through making sure that people understand their rights under the law in multiple jurisdictions across national lines, which is really tricky. And one of the reasons why we recommend that trans folks and non-binary folks reach out directly to their community centers right now. Community centers are going to have the most updated information about how laws impact your particular jurisdiction, whether that's your state, your county, or your city. Aaron, how do you recommend folks reach out and be in contact with their community centers? Is it easy to drop into a community center? Can folks, I recommend folks, for example, go onto Centerlink, which will have information about your local center. But I'd love to hear from you as well.
Yeah, of course. So really getting connected to community centers, we try to be as accessible as possible. We try to, provide our services in the languages, that our community needs. So many of our folks sitting at the front desk, we provide drop-in services. And so folks don't need an appointment. Folks can be in a crisis and they can come to our doors. Our crisis navigation team is extremely competent. And that they are just so on it that by the time that folks have processed kind of what's happening to them, a lot of times they're already connected to the services. They have an appointment for housing. They have an appointment, whether it's they're reporting a hate crime or something like that. Like those are things that we are very, very good and responsive to. So drop-ins are amazing. I would also say that as far as really getting connected with community centers outside of our provision of services, we really just need folks out there and using their voices to advocate for the needs of our community on the level of to our local governments. Right now, we are very aware that a lot of LGBTQIA plus serving organizations, their funding is under threat, right? We have seen just a lot of austerity cuts already preemptively by organizations, large scale cuts, upwards of like 25% of some organization staff, programs getting cut outright. And so I would really say that being able to understand like how the public comment process works at your local city council, at your county board of supervisors, understanding how to submit e-comments. We were talking about that as far as commenting, on federal actions and policies and doing that through the ACLU. These are really crucial things because guess what? If you end up getting 30 or 40 folks to call about an issue for, the provision of gender affirming care in your state to your congressional delegation, then chances are they'll actually listen to you. One of the reasons why we see so many congressional delegates, doing things where it's like, wait, that's not representative of your community, is it? It's because the opposition really understands how to organize. They understand how to make sure that folks show up, make sure that their voice is heard, to make it seem like they are a bigger proportion of the constituency than folks may than they may actually be. And so we really need folks to be showing up and telling their local city council members, telling their the supervisors sitting on the county board of supervisors that you need to be funding LGBTQIA plus affirming housing services, mental health services. You need to make sure that we have access to food, that we actually have safe spaces to congregate even, right? And so I would say that the community centers are a great space, but in order to ensure that these spaces continue to exist in a meaningful way, and that they're able to provide services that actually respond to the community's needs as we hear them, we need to be able to work with our local elected officials to make that happen.
Thank you so much, Aaron. That actually answers the question I was going to bring to us to close, which is, what can trans and non-binary people do right now to regain a sense of control and autonomy over our own lives right now? We talked about getting informed. We talked about doing some advocacy, whether that's at your local, state, or national level. Elizabeth, can you tell us a little bit about the comment period and how folks can submit comments through the ACLU? I can drop the link in the YouTube chat as well, so folks will have that while you talk.
Yeah, I think with respect to the comments, it should be, there should be directions on the form. There's also, we also do have materials up that are Q&As about the lawsuits that we have and what impact those have. And if folks are experiencing passport problems, we have a form for that as well. Just again, trying to keep track of who's out there. And then I would just second everything that, Aaron just said about acting locally. I'm also based in San Francisco, and supporting our politicians who are working to support our community is important. It's important that they hear from us. It is the national environment feels very scary. It feels like prominent support of trans folks and issues related to trans folks is a bigger lift today than it was previously, and even that's even true in a state like California. So I think for if we can support our leaders who are supporting us, that's very important that they hear from us.
Thank you so much. Merrique, I'm going to give you the last word before we say goodbye and ask you, what is one thing that trans and non-binary people can do right now to regain control?
I mean, we already have control, right? We're living in our bodies and our truth. Come on, like that's control, right? So I think instead, like can I reframe that? I think what trans folks can do is like, how do we lean into our resiliency? I mean, this came up at the town hall, right? Is that it is meant for us to feel scared and feel alone and feel crazy, right? Like I actually think what's more important is that there's something that we're all doing, even as maybe like scared or sad as we do feel, that actually is working for us. It's actually how we got to where we are. And so I think leaning on our own sets of strengths, our own the own ways that make us uniquely creative and beautiful and strong is important. But I also think with that, it's important to lean on each other, right? To not, because like isolation is meant to be a tactic in all of this. It's meant to keep us alone and feel like we don't have community, feel like people hate us. And so still like finding those folks, creating those circles, right? Taking those moments of chance to say, maybe right now I don't feel like I can, I don't feel comfortable necessarily going to like a straight or a cis environment primarily, but maybe I'm gonna like go to like this larger LGBT thing, or maybe I'm actually really disconnected from the LGBTQ community. So I'm going to go connect with like other migrant or immigration organizers, or, like I think that there's ways we can connect with other folks who are like-minded that will support us. So I think within that, just not to stay in ourselves, to connect with community and to remember that there's things we're already doing that are strong.
That's absolutely right. We do have control. We are gorgeous. We are everywhere. We are everything. Trans and non-binary people are just the alpha and omega. So I thank you so much for that reframe, Marique. And I will thank Elizabeth and Aaron for joining us today. Thank you so much for representing truly the best of kind of queer community right now, educating one another, making sure that we have opportunities to talk back to our public officials who are there to represent us and to represent our concerns. So thank you so much for sharing here and for your work. A couple of things to uplift from the call. If you'd like to join the community conversation tomorrow, the Know Your Rights that the LGBT Community Center of San Diego is having, is there an easy way folks can join that, Aaron?
So this first session is actually going to be held in person. I know that a lot of folks typically have been doing these virtually, especially just for the safety of our community, but our community specifically wanted this first session in person, and they just wanted to feel a sense of togetherness and security with each other. So we're not going to be providing a virtual link to this first session, but as we kind of build things out, we are going to be continuing to hopefully expand the accessibility to these sessions. For any updates on the work that the San Diego LGBT Community Center is doing, you can follow us on Instagram at LGBT Center. And we got lucky with that handle. It's at LGBT Center. And then you can also go to our website, thecentersd.org. Again, that's thecentersd.org. And we send pretty frequent updates, and you'll see new events coming from us very soon.
Thank you so much. Quickly, Elizabeth, is there a way folks should follow the ACLU?
I mean, we're all, on social media and on, have a website that we try to keep updated. So please engage. We push out lots of ways for folks to engage.
Thank you so much. And I just dropped the comment portal in the YouTube comments. So if you're watching this on YouTube, please join over there. Marique, how can folks get involved with Transformations?
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to plug two of our sites. So the main organizational website is Transformations with an S, KC is in Kansas City.org.org. So transformationskc.org. Our other website that's really great is to talk more about that specific camp we do in the Ozarks, liberationcamp.org. And we do have an active fundraising campaign we just launched today. We are looking to raise $20,000 as a way to sustain our programming and work. As we know, funding is being divested. So if folks are interested in learning more about that, they can go to our Instagram, TikTok, or Facebook at KC Transformations.
Thank you so much to the three of you. If you're watching, please follow us on YouTube and Facebook as we continue these important conversations this month. In March, we'll also be having a conversation from our Disability Justice Program and a conversation around Trans Day of Visibility. Also, please sign up for our newsletter so you can find out when our next conversations are. And again, thank you so much for joining us. Have a great night.